Welcome, everybody, to Navigating Change, the podcast from Tybal Inc. I'm Pete Wright, here, as always, with Howard Tybal.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you today, Pete.
Such a pleasure. We're waiting for Snowmageddon for you.
Snowmageddon, but I think they're inflating this whole problem. I don't think it's going to be as bad. Did you get that, by the way, the whole inflating? They're inflating. Do you have any connection to what's going on?
Are you making a data joke already?
No, I'm making a football joke. Wow, you are on the loop.
You forget where I live. Is there a sports ball game going on somewhere that I missed?
There will be. This talk about controversy, but we won't go there.
Oh.
Tara, you know what I'm talking about, right?
I absolutely do.
There we go. All right, Pete, so introduce our guest.
So I'm the third wheel. I get it. We are still, even though I'm already being made fun of, we are thrilled to have our guest here. Terra Schehr is the Assistant Vice President for Institutional Research and Effectiveness at Loyola University Maryland. Terra, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
We have talked, well, first of all, we've talked a bunch about Loyola. We had a wonderful series of conversations with representatives from Loyola talking about a new way of proceeding. Episodes 72, 73, and 74, if you're interested in going back and listening to those episodes, we had some great conversations with folks talking about the importance of the administrative review and how they went through it at Loyola. So listeners of the show will be familiar with sort of the Loyola story. But part of the reason we wanted to invite Terra to join the show is to talk a little bit about the importance and the role of institutional research, what IR does when it's doing its job really well. Now, Howard, you have had a chance to work with Terra in the past, yes?
Yeah, and so here's what prompted me in our planning of these kind of conversations. I think this question of data is increasingly become important as data becomes more available and we're learning how to process it better. This kind of activity is something that institutions can use to supplement their work and to help guide. And this is what we'll talk about a little bit. Are we guiding change? Are we driving change? And Terra is in the center of that. In my experience of Terra and the group at Loyola is that they're very much ahead of the curve. Matter of fact, they're spending, and tell me if you agree with this, Terra, a lot of their time trying to even educate people within their institution about what they can do, because I think there's a misunderstanding of how much institutional research can provide to an institution to help guide where they're going. And I thought that it's really important to raise this for institutional leaders to go back and say, are we effectively using IR? So, this is sort of how I want to kick this off with you, Terra, is if you think about, I'm looking at the mission statement about what IR does. When you think about the discipline of institutional research and when it's really humming and serving the institution, what are they fundamentally doing? And again, we've got listeners who might even not know exactly what IR does. So if you can just give us a brief primer of when you're doing the work and you're really serving the institution, what are you actually doing and how's that playing out?
Sure. And, I have my little elevator speech that I use on this that I've stolen bits and pieces from other colleagues. And what I tell folks is that if you think about what the U.S. Census Bureau does for studying the U.S. demography, and then you think about what the Brookings Institute does in terms of studying policy, I am Loyola's Census Bureau and Brookings Institute. And when we're working well and when we're serving the university well, we're wearing both of those hats.
That's perfect. Boy, that really does sum it up. So when I think about decision making, and you think about when you get inserted in this process, how do you find that you get pulled into something or find yourself saying, I should be involved in this? What are the things you're finding that's happening today where you're finding yourself being inserted into really important conversations?
Well, and I've been fortunate at Loyola. I think it's because for 2 rounds now, our vice president of academic affairs has been mathematicians. So they like numbers and they want the numbers people in the room. And now our VPAA is a psychologist, and she's a researcher at heart. And so she also wants the data person in the room. So I've been fortunate to be at the table, and that doesn't always happen. But when I'm at the table early enough in a conversation to know whether I should continue to be involved, whether there's something that my office can lend, that's when we're working really well.
So what kind of data are you finding today that you're being asked to either research or present at the cabinet level, or even for boards where they're trying to drive some different decision making?
Well, an awful lot of benchmarking on just about everything from enrollments to pricing to expenditures. We do an awful lot of benchmarking, and I have a particular idea about whether that's a good thing or not. But we do that a lot. And then the other big piece is satisfaction and student experience. We have a robust survey research program here, and the Board of Trustees in particular and the cabinet as well really want to hear what our students are saying about their experience and the value they're getting out of their time at Loyola.
So, Pete and I had this conversation before we got started about benchmarking. When you just mentioned in terms of surveying students, I love that particular thing, because what this is a way that you're saying we may not know, we think we know what our students need or what they want or what our faculty need or want, but we're going to ask. And it sounds like you play a big part in reaching out and getting that information. So to me, that's an invaluable thing. We think we know our customers or the people we're trying to serve, but we often don't. With respect to benchmarking, and this is where I am challenged sometimes, because sometimes we're asked to do a benchmarking study, and so we'll ask, give us your peer and aspirant schools. Okay, so we get those, and then we look at either publicly available data through iPads, or we look at other data, and sometimes we have to survey, and all this stuff is familiar to you. But what I find in the end, when the data comes back and we're sitting down and we're trying to look and use that data, it seems to me, and this is where I'd love your perspective, it seems to me that often what it does is it's used to give us almost not much more than a comfort level that we're not either too far behind, or hopefully we're ahead. But beyond that, I find benchmarking sometimes to be a very limited way of thinking about trying to produce the kind of change that's right for that particular institution. Do you understand where I'm coming from?
I do. And, here you're going to have the data person telling you that the data is not important. But, benchmarking certainly plays a critical role. But, there's a saying about benchmarking, which is that even pigeons can do it. And I think sometimes it prevents institutions from thinking for themselves. What is it that we want to be doing vis-a-vis our mission or our aspirations, if all we do is look outside and do the environmental scan and the benchmarking to see what everyone else is doing and where we fit in with that. Students and parents now, and adult learners too, at the graduate and continuing education side, have a certain idea of what college or university is going to be like, and they generally paint a pretty similar picture year over year and institution to institution. And so you're right, Pete. I think, it's beholden to the institution for us to do a little bit of thinking for ourselves in terms of, what we think is the right and appropriate thing to do.
Are you finding, Terra, you're much closer to being asked for this kind of things? These become sort of mini projects often on larger projects that we're doing. But do you find that you have to work hard to get people to understand not just what you can provide, but why it's important?
Again, I'm going to say not so much at Loyola. I mean,
That's great.
they really, from the time that I came in 2006, I've been able to be at the table and build an office and a program that's generated enough social capital here where people really don't hesitate to call me in and to bring us into the conversation. Now, that's not the case of many of my colleagues.
Well, see, what's interesting about, and I'll tell you that when you say be at the table, what I assume you mean is that you actually get to sit in on meetings of the senior leaders, the vice presidents and the president, and listen to the kinds of things they're concerned about directly versus being told through some other party, this is what you need to be doing, correct?
Correct. And, I feel good when about 70% of what my office does are the things that someone has asked us to do, and the other 30% are the things that we know we can do to be helpful because we know what conversations are happening.
It's such an interesting thing, Pete, because this kind of having a seat at the table can be represented in other disciplines in higher ed. So, for example, there's a huge array of how HR as a division is engaged in strategy. And often if you have somebody at the table, and it's a vice president in some cases, you have a greater capacity to understand the issues because you're there listening. And I'll tell you that what I'm hoping is that some people listening to this who are looking at structure, they're saying, how do we put IR people in a place where they can be listening directly versus just being delegated to? Because that's what I see. That's where I see this. You don't get great support from IR when they're not engaged the way you are. And so how did you build that? Was it always the case you were at the table, or did you actually, as part of the work, moved yourself in that direction?
A slight combination of both. I mean, we have a group at Loyola called the Council of Academic Deans, and they meet about every other week or so. And from the beginning, I was part of that group. And from being there, and I think folks saw the value that IR could provide through what we were able to bring to that group and help them with, then I became involved in the Academic Senate and the Loyola Conference. I go to cabinet meetings fairly regularly, and it sort of snowballed from being able to be in that one group of folks who just sit around and think about what the challenges are and how to do things better.
I'm really fascinated to go back just a minute. You mentioned the split, about 70-30, 70% of your work in your office comes from the work that you're asked to do, and 30% is the work that you feel, is, for lack of a better term, I'm sort of thinking about it as entrepreneurial research, right? The stuff that you undertake because you believe it'll help the institution. Can you talk a little bit about more about what makes up that 30% and what are the trends and data points that inspire you to go further on your own?
Yeah, well, a concrete example of that, Pete, would be something like our test optional admissions policy. I happened to be in a meeting where it was talked about that we might want to try this. And so I came back to my office and our staff got together and we set about looking at what the experience had been at other institutions, some of our peer institutions, what we might be able to expect. We modeled out what we could expect from it and really helped to come to the decision that it really is the right thing for the institution to do. And at the same time, committed that our office would look closely at our experience with that and would assess that and make sure that, it was functioning the way we wanted it to. And so we did that over a course of 4 pilot years. So that's a sort of example of something that someone didn't ask us to do. We knew that there was a conversation happening, and we said, hey, we can help you with that.
And then it goes directly back in to drive us, strategic decisions across, I imagine, academic departments, eventually the institution.
Right.
Here's something I find fascinating, having done or participated in the new way of proceeding, having done some prior and actually doing some now. And, I got to work closely at different times with Terra on this and got to see the kinds of information she was able to provide not only to the committee, but to the co-chairs. And what's interesting is in the absence of a strong institutional research group, or that they're not central part of the initiative, the question I struggle with, but I have a certain optimism of the people who are in the roles where they have to consider making changes. And in many ways, they know what's working and not working. What they don't know is maybe some of the facts, the financial facts, some of the ratios, and some of that stuff is important. But one of the things I try to do, Terra, is give a larger benefit of the doubt to people who work through an organization, that they can be part of solving their own problem. And I find a lot of variation in this. I see a lot of institutions that don't have that confidence that their people could do this and sort of offload the whole exercise to outside consultants, and others who go directly to the institution or these institution leaders, and they expect them to have all the answers. And I don't find a sort of a good understanding how to do it in a balanced way. So when you reflect back on New Way of Proceeding, what do you think? What do you think went well about that, where data was used in a way that helped forward decision making?
Well, I think you were there when we met as a group of, 100 or so folks, everyone who was working on it. And one of the things that I told them was, please don't ask me for a data point, ask me a question. And I think that that's when it works well for us, is when folks ask a question, because like Pete said, folks often don't know what IR is. They don't know what we have, what we can lend to the process. And so if folks aren't hemmed in by this preconceived notion of what data is available, then we can really go a lot farther.
I love that distinction. And I'll tell you, when we've done that on other projects, and when the reaction from people, the first reaction is, and I think you were anticipating this, is they assume that if you just give them data, that will somehow move them in a direction. And what you're basically saying is, I can get you data, but I need to understand first the kinds of questions you're engaged in. And in one respect, that's common sense, but for some reason, we don't lead from that. So why do you find that people don't sort of naturally gravitate in that way?
Well, I think because of, some of the way we talk about this, we've gone from data-driven decision-making to data-informed decision-making. But the word data is still so pivotal there. And, one of the things that I think does not work well is when we assume that the audience or the receiver of the data is an analyst. That's really our job in my shop, is to analyze the data. And we really don't try and provide data. Actually, what we really try and provide is information, because we don't want to leave it up to the person receiving it to be able to understand all of the context and nuance about those data points. We want to do that for them and give them information instead of data.
I'm so glad you said that. That feels like probably the number one misunderstanding of institutional research, at least in my experience, is that you're just providing the data and not the interpretation, when really interpretation is so key in not being paralyzed by data points if you just don't know how to interpret it.
Right. And the interpretation, it can be a little dicey, though, because we're not subject matter experts in most cases. We're not student development professionals. We're not, faculty affairs professionals for the most part. We're not advancement professionals. So there's the subject matter expertise that needs to be brought to it that we can't provide, but we can get you, kind of halfway around that loop. And that's what we try and do. So we're kind of like the Joe Fridays of the data, just the facts. We don't do interpretation in terms of saying, for the most part, in terms of saying this is a good thing or a bad thing, but we will tell you what the thing is.
Well, and I'll tell you that from an organizational acclimation standpoint, this demands or requires trust, for groups to not just to reach out to you and say, here's the information, be aware that you can help them with that. Then take that, you do the analysis, you do the interpretation. that really demands a high level of building an organization where people look to you and say, not only can we trust your data, but we trust that you understand what you know and you understand what you don't know. And it sounds very much like you come at this with clarity about, here's our boundary. Here's what we can do, and we're not going to pretend like we're the subject matter experts on the ground, but here's what we can give you. And I think those are really important distinctions to make, and that builds trust.
Yeah, I think you're right, and we've done a good job. I mean, you're talking to me, but I'm one person in an office of 5 people who have done a good job really in generating trust on campus. And so people really view us, and we try really hard at this, to view us as, the truth teller, that we don't have a particular agenda. And that although, we may report in some particular reporting line, we work for the university. We're really one of those sort of pan-campus functions.
Yes. So looking forward, where would you say this whole question of data, big data, with respect to higher ed, do you see anything shifting significantly in how you gather and what you're gathering in terms of data, or do you see in the next 3 to 5 years we're going to have faster ability to get the data, but fundamentally the process is going to continue as is? What do you see looking forward?
Well, I think, and I'm not quite sure how I feel about this, but I think one of the things that's going to be developing are the longitudinal data systems, at least on a state basis. And several states are farther along than others on this, where we track students from, K-12 all the way up through their post-secondary education and then out into the job force, because, everyone is so concerned with outcomes, and rightfully so. So, that's going to become a bigger player, I think, for IR offices to get into those data and be able to utilize them. But other than that, I think that, the technical tools to get at the data, to analyze the data, more seamlessly, more quickly, those things may come along. But it really, I think the training that is happening right now with some postgraduate certificate programs for folks in IR is probably going to be the single biggest change in the field, where most folks, myself included, never knew that this field existed until we fell over ourselves into it. And so now we have people who are actually being trained in the subject matter areas, in the technical areas, and that's just going to improve the service that IR can provide to institutions in the future.
What a great story to tell, and what a great service to provide institutions. And clearly Loyola is making great use of your office's expertise in making strategic decisions. It's a real treat to have you on the show, Terra. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Pete.
Howard, I'm so glad that you brought Terra to our attention.
Well, it's interesting because after having, the chief business officer or finance perspective, the administration perspective, the faculty perspective, I think you can see now why this leg of the table was a really important piece, because we had 10 teams, and again, Terra does a lot more than that. Just that one project was one piece of a much bigger pie of what she's done before and done after. But I can tell you that having her available to 10 teams and 100 people, and not necessarily all of them took advantage of it, but those that did, you can see the value where they can then not get stopped because they're stuck in this idea, we don't have the data. And that's what we're finding in a lot of these projects, is that decision-making gets stalled when people begin to say to themselves, we don't have some core fundamental, or as Terra's saying, the distinction, more information, the right information. I think we have to train people more and more how to even ask for this. And I think that's a discipline, Terra, I would imagine that you're continuously focusing on, which is how do we educate people about not what we can do, but how we can help them.
Yeah, it's always something we're trying to work on here.
So it's great. So thank you, Terra. Really fantastic it's fantastic for our listeners to hear this piece of it, and I think you're going to be in the middle of some very exciting things going on in the future. So it's just great having worked with you.
Thanks. It's a fun job.
I think if there is any moral to this story, if you are listening to this and you don't work at Loyola, you probably don't know enough about your own Department of Institutional Research. You should check them out and ask them some great questions, or ask them to help you ask some great questions. This is a terrific resource.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So, on behalf of Terra Schehr, Assistant Vice President for Institutional Research and Effectiveness at Loyola University Maryland, and the great and powerful Howard Teibel.
Terry, he does this all the time. I never know it.
I am Pete Wright. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody. Find us at TeibelInc.com. You can subscribe to the show for free in iTunes. Make sure you don't miss a single episode. And we'll catch you next week on Navigating Change, the podcast from Teibel Inc.